Racism is one of the challenges that confront the world today, and as South Africans, it has confronted everyone who is in this room for all of their lives. I'm hoping that tonight the panel is going to define what is racism today, how does it manifest itself, and interestingly we have to talk about the criminalization of racism. And I posed a question today on Twitter and didn't get any answers regarding, can you criminalize racism? Or would you be criminalizing aspects of it, such as hate speech and racist hate speech and racist physical attacks on people? But I'm interested in what the panel is going to say. Steve Biko said the following: we have set out on a quest for true humanity, and somewhere on the distant horizon we can see the glittering prize. He says, but not all form of speech makes any contribution to democratic debate or enhance our personal well-being. In fact, some forms of expression harm individuals or groups with no discernible benefit for society, for individuals, or for our democracy. This is why our law places limits on our right to defame others, why it is a criminal offense to incite others to commit crimes or to commit fraud by lying to others in order to benefit from it.
So in other words, to try and set some of the parameters of the debate and the legal meaning of hate speech, which is a form of racist speech. I want to look a little bit at the ambit of hate speech in the Constitution and in the underutilized Equality Act, which I think provides wonderful remedies for the person in the street, if you like. It's no surprise that our Constitution also deals with the issue of hate speech. In other words, hate speech is not seen to be part of freedom of expression. It is not constitutionally protected, and to the extent that you engage in this thing called hate speech, you are engaged in an unconstitutional act. Our Constitution in section 16 prohibits hate speech that constitutes advocacy of hatred and incitement to harm. That kind of harm does not need to be physical harm. It can be emotional and psychological harm, and one would also take account of the indirect harm to society. So there's no question that in South Africa we can regulate hate speech. The question is whether we want to regulate it civilly or criminally.
I don't think we should even be having this conversation about criminalization of racism, because I think we are avoiding a deeper question and a harder question, and that is the question of decolonization. I think another conversation that would be nice to have right now is how to dismantle whiteness, which perpetuates racism. Another conversation I'd like to have is when are we taking back our stolen land?
Yes.
And yes, dismantling whiteness. So that's a conversation I'd like to have, because I don't like the way that racism has been defined in our national discourse. The TRC process failed to acknowledge that racism is institutional, it's structural, it's not just about individuals being unkind to each other, it's about power. But because it is a system that promotes domination and subjugation, the prejudicial feelings some blacks may express about whites are in no way linked to a system of domination that affords us any power to coercively control the lives and well-beings of white folks. Decades earlier, Steve Biko said, the color question in South African politics was introduced for economic reasons. The leaders of the white community had to create some kind of barrier between blacks and whites, so that the whites would enjoy the privileges at the expense of blacks and still feel free to give moral justifications for their obvious exploitations.
But I also think that criminalizing racism is probably going to perhaps be tantamount to forcing dialogue to change and forcing dialogue to perhaps be very limited in terms of how we can talk about issues of race. So I think that when we talk about criminalizing racism, we have to be quite careful in terms of what kind of implication that's going to have. It's going to be a significant challenge to then try and narrow the definition of racism to a particular form of speech or a particular form of behavior. And I think that there's a significant danger that comes with that in terms of perhaps not then significantly or adequately addressing issues of economic domination, issues of social prejudice.
From the EU perspective, the EU and its member states have a strong equality and non-discrimination legislation. So we have the legal tools in place. We have the policies and the laws and the legislation in place that criminalizes racism. There's no doubt about that. So that discussion for me, coming from outside and coming to South Africa, it's quite surprising that we're having that discussion in South Africa, considering South Africa's history. That's what democracy is about. People need to feel that they are protected in the countries that they live in. And in the entire European Union, now there's legislation that makes sure that people are protected. And I will just give you one example. In Europe, there's a picture that you can see on the screen. Yes, it's a picture of me, my face. Now, because I fight against racism, people found it racist, found it necessary to do a picture of me as a slave, an enslaved African in chains, and they wrote my name on it, saying that this is a runaway nigger slave, and his name is Jallow. If you should find him, please call this number. And this picture was posted all around the city where I live. Because we have this legislation, because we criminalized this, he was taken to court by me, and he was found guilty and sentenced to jail. Now, he learned his lesson because he said, because he was sentenced to jail, he would never, ever do it again. That is for the betterment of the society that we live in, so that I and everybody like me can feel protected by the law.
How I decide what is excellence and who I exclude and who I include without necessarily saying anything. And obviously that kind of racism you can't deal with through criminalization.
I'm against the proposal of criminalizing racism, racist speech. I think it's a very difficult process to understand and to put parameters around. I appreciate fully that racism is extremely divisive. I'm just not convinced that the process of applying laws to it is the approach that we should take. Because for me, the problem I have with the idea of criminalizing racism is that racist speech is intended to harm, is intended to hurt. That's the intent. It can only happen if someone believes they're in a position of strength or dominance to be able to make such a statement. They do so, and they do so because they believe that saying whatever they say will cause you harm. I am not going to give someone the authority, the right, or the pleasure of being able to say you can cause me harm. That your statements are going to be derogatory. You can call me whatever you want. You can draw pictures of me, you can put me in chains, you can send me whatever you like. You will never, ever take away my dignity.
But what I think is valuable about civil remedies of hate speech is that it can repair dignity. It's the point that Millard was making. That your ability to go and make that complaint, to hold somebody to account, to get compensation, to get a declaration that what was done to you was wrong, is important for dignity. That doesn't mean to say that there aren't extreme forms of racist hate speech that you might want to criminalize.
So this, for me, impacts about who's going to get criminalized if racism is criminalized. For instance, I've written, just by challenging white supremacy, calling out whiteness in this country, you are the one labeled as racist. So I'm scared that because blacks don't have access, as much access and social power of the courts and the justice system as whites do, that whites will use the courts to further white supremacy because it's there to further their agenda.
If you look at women, there was a time that women didn't have rights to vote in Europe, in country that I came from, that I live, in Sweden, women did not have rights to vote until 1921. It was legislated, and that is what forced men to change their attitudes and change the norms, and now it's not a question of whether they should vote or not. At my workplace, if my boss files a complaint that I discriminated my boss, it would never work in the law in Sweden. Because they say you are in a power relation, you are employing him, and therefore have power over him, and therefore cannot use this law.
Black people are the majority in South Africa, and they certainly do have political power. Today, people are losing jobs. White people are losing jobs when they have been perceived to have said something racist, because political power is being used to make sure that happens. So we aren't a powerless majority in South Africa.
The power that we're talking about is not only limited to political power. There are three kinds of power. The political power is one of them. The power of the production of knowledge, who is behind the production of the knowledge that we read at university and school.
Absolutely, that's social power, cultural power, and economic power.
And the economic power, which is the production of material. Who are the people that own the wealth in this country? Absolutely. You have to take all those three into consideration. You cannot only focus on, because now, after all these years, you have black people leading this country, so all of a sudden they have the power. It doesn't change the power dynamic that fast. It takes time, and it needs a lot of other changes for black people to become in a power position, for us to be able to say they can perpetuate the same kind of racism that white people have perpetuated on black people. You have to understand that.
Generalizations are the product of vulgar minds. To me, though, this means that if somebody says that blacks are this, whites are that, Jews are this, Greeks are thieves, this is that, this is that, is not going to help us if we try to criminalize generalizations by vulgar minds. You go to court, the probabilities are that the generalization is not going to be declared as unlawful for the purposes of criminal law. And I would appeal to all of us to have a little bit of faith in our Constitution, our judges, our legal profession, and find ways and means of which putting an end to racism. And I may say to the young lady, I expect a little bit more optimism about our future.
The definition of racism hasn't been given. It says that racism is to adhere characteristics to someone, an individual, based on a presumed group identity. Now again, I'm from a European university, and it is a very strong consensus that the idea of race is in fact a social construct. And I've been hearing about dismantling whiteness, for example, and I am 100% in agreement with dismantling race, with dismantling the idea that race is what makes you who you are.
Even though we're trying to undo the damage done by apartheid, but by having people in race categories and asking people to put on a piece of paper, my race is African, my race is Asian, you may be reinforcing that.
So for those people that have always had privilege in their entire lives, the moment those people that have never had privilege start talking about equality, then we start to hear from those on top that it is injustice, we cannot have it. That's how it feels, because you're losing your privilege. But for those of us whose norm is injustice, equality is a privilege.
Racism is something that sometimes we ourselves are not aware of when we're being racist, or perhaps when other people experience us as racist. So I think to start criminalizing behaviors that we ourselves are not aware of is perhaps to jump the gun a little bit, because we do need to start becoming more aware of our own behaviors and our own prejudices and the way in which we interact with one another.
I grew up in poverty. I see black poverty, landlessness. The students, I go to school, brilliant young people can't afford to go to get an education is because of the color of their skin and the history that this country has. So it'd be very nice for me to want to dismantle race, but I can't because I'm a black woman living in South Africa. So your question is just like making me angry actually.
I know it's a social construct, but that doesn't mean that I as a black person or a Muslim person or a Roma person is not disproportionately disadvantaged in the society that we live in.
1994, in fact before 1994, black people allowed a Eurocentric definition of what they were fighting for. In other words, they compromised themselves and got, crumbs that we call today freedom. Because the democracy that exists in this country is anti-black, is anti-poor, it favors the rich. Define it. It is black people, the victims of racism, who have to define what they mean and what should be done about racism. Not the bourgeois.
Black people want their land, they want the economy back, but because we can't get that because there has to be a domineering presence in a state, if we should sacrifice white lives, why not to attain the democracy and the peace that you're advocating for? We are the majority. It makes sense.
I am, though, appealing to young people to say, don't assume that just because somebody is white, they are on the other side. It is said that one of the key pillars of oppression is the mind of the oppressed, and that's what Steve Biko said. But also, if you read Lao Tzu, which I believe some of the young people are reading, The Art of War, one of the key pillars of fighting a successful war is making inroads in a besieged castle. Because if you're on the other side and there's a wall on the other side, you're not going to make it. Everyone wants a South Africa where everybody's humanity is affirmed, not just by stopping insults, but making sure that the improved quality of life for every person is there, as Simamkele is saying. Don't paint everyone because we're making the same mistake by saying because you look like that, you belong to a particular category of thinking.
Racists of any colour are damaged people, and they should be pitied because they are living a life within themselves of some hell. But I'd like to actually quote Kubler-Ross's very simple statement that she made. And she said, we are all responsible for our own emotions.
And it feels in many ways in these conversations that when we talk about criminalising hate speech or dealing with unfair discrimination, it feels like a band-aid. Because in a sense, those individual things can't in and of themselves deal with the systemic problem. So you end up feeling quite helpless. I do think that hearing each other and dialogue and talking across difference and listening remains critically important.
And I'm optimistic purely because we are able to have these conversations and because there are free spaces like this to have these conversations.
With the student movements that have risen in the country, the only hope that I have is with them because they are asking the questions that are difficult and many are avoiding. They are demanding justice. They want their land back, they want decolonization, and the only faith that I have is through them that the next time we won't need to have this conversation because whiteness will be dismantled.
We find ourselves at a crossroad where we have to choose if we're going to expand, be inclusive, unity, and build the nation, or if you're going to go back to racism and go back to division and hatred. And just to assure ourselves that the struggle that our forefathers have gone through is not in vain, we need to make sure that we succeed in building this country into one unified country. We need to find common ground. That's extremely important because common ground is the only recipe that you have for success.
And the optimism, you can call it whatever you like, but the optimism I see here is what I think is the future. It will take a long time. And as I think Martin Luther King did say, I can see the top of the mountain, I may not make it. Well, if you don't strive, you won't.
I do still think that those who have started the dialogue, despite the warning that it might whitewash things, they've done a great thing. Because the fights that have been created by blatant racist hate speech are threatening to tear the nation apart. Perhaps they've been good in a way that they've awakened us to the reality of dealing with the structural issues. But going forward, we need to find a more constructive way. We need to get back to our understanding that we signed up to be a different society than the one we were during apartheid. We signed up to be a new society that affirms everybody's humanity. But from your side, what are you willing to do to contribute to taking us back on track towards the South Africa we sought to become, where everyone's humanity is affirmed and where nobody feels like they don't belong here? Thank you.